My name is Leo Drager. Welcome to Cyber IT. I'm going to be your local subject matter expert. Today we're going to look at modern forensics. Let's take a closer look. Forensics has basically evolved over time, right? In 1822 through about 1911, this is where we had our first study of fingerprints, and now we can all appreciate this today, but it really goes back into the 18th century. In 1887 to about the 1954 time frame, this is where we started looking at blood grouping. At this point, we could only realistically look at type A versus B versus type O blood types. We weren't nearly getting into DNA, at least as we were today. In 1891 to about 1955, this is where we had the study of firearms, pioneered by Goddard. You had 1858 through about 1946. This is where documentation-style evidence was pioneered by Osborne. You had 1847 through 1915. This is the criminal investigation process by Gross. You had 1932, the invention of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Up until about 1984, computer analysis and response teams sort of became mainstream. 1993, we had the first international conference on cybercrime. Up until 1995, this is where we had the International Organization of Computer Evidence. 1998, getting close to modern times, this is where we had the first science symposium. 2000, most of the FBI regional offices were deployed. And 2015, welcome to Leo Drager and Cyber IT. So most attacks realistically still focus on external attacks and internal attacks, and that's what we see up here. But the study of forensics as a whole was basically using any sort of physical sciences to basically find and prove the truth. And you have to keep your thoughts grounded in that concept, because ultimately at the end of the day, we're just looking for scientific facts that prove the truth, okay? Now, since we are talking about evidence, keep in mind that ultimately we want to preserve evidence to the point where we can do something with it. Most of the time, that means actually getting it into a courtroom. So we try to avoid contamination wherever possible. And you can chalk this up to manipulating evidence or any unauthorized change, modification, or alteration in the scope of the evidence as you're trying to get it from the different parts of the process, ultimately in the court, okay? So the big picture processes here is somebody's got to identify evidence as evidence, okay? Once it's identified as evidence, then we have to preserve it to make sure that from the time it's identified all the way through the life cycle, it has basically a chain of custody. You cannot talk about anything forensics oriented without the magic words of chain of custody, because chain of custody dictates who, what, when, where, why, and how of the evidence throughout the complete life cycle. The extraction of the evidence, in other words, how do we take it from the crime scene ultimately into a lab, analyze it, do some reports on it, and ultimately get it to court. The interpretation of the evidence by both the prosecution and defense. The documentation of that evidence, which is ultimately reporting, to include things like chain of custody and evidence preservation and things of the like, and then ultimately to the courtroom. Okay? So if we take those steps, those big picture process steps, and kind of break them down in a little bit more detail, basically, a crime has happened. Well, just because a crime has happened doesn't mean that anybody has identified it as a crime yet, okay? So this is where someone's going to have to identify, hey, a crime scene has taken place. So I would chalk both steps 1 and 2 here into the identification process. Next, the preservation concepts. You may have to get a warrant or a subpoena or voluntary consent for the evidence. There's going to have to be a first responder that goes to the scene and actually evaluate the evidence. And ultimately, we're going to have to seize it. In other words, we're going to have to take it, preserve it, so that we can take it back to our lab and actually analyze it. And then I would go into the third step here, extraction. This would be transporting it, actually making the bit-by-bit copies of the evidence, in this case digital evidence, as opposed to DNA or blood types or something of the like, firearms. We're going to have to prove that it has integrity, and this is where we use our Methods Digest and our SHA algorithms to analyze hard drives and file systems and partitions to prove that there's no unauthorized change, modification, or alterations. Ultimately, chain of custody, and then the storage of it till we actually get it to the point where we can review the evidence. Then we have to actually analyze it. This would be the interpretation. Report on it. This would be the documentation, and ultimately go to court, where this is where we make our final presentation to a judge or jury so that they can make the best determination possible. Okay? So that's really the big picture of what goes on in the modern forensics world. But a few other very, very important factors to keep in mind here. Okay? Evidence needs to be whole, admissible, accurate, authentic, and acceptable. So let's talk about each one of these just briefly. Whole. Whole means complete. In other words, you have the whole smoking gun, you have the whole fingerprint, you have the whole hard drive, not just working in parts of things. Because when you're only working on a fraction of a piece of evidence, well, what about the other half of it that you don't have? It's really hard to prove or disprove something if you have missing pieces. Admissible, it has to be able to get into a court. And this is where we look at, is the evidence competent? In other words, proper evidence collecting procedures. Is it relevant to the case? Does it prove or disprove something? Okay. Is it accurate? In other words, is the evidence trustworthy? In other words, if you run a forensics tool against something, is the result actually proving or disproving a fact relevant to the case? We like evidence to be authentic. This is more of a easier concept than it really sounds. Authentic just meaning true evidence, best evidence, original evidence, and as close to the smoking gun as we possibly can get. And ultimately acceptable. In other words, the judge or the jury is going to accept it in a way that ultimately is going to prove or disprove a fact or finding. Okay? So let's look at how we can apply these basic concepts to all of the different types of dare I say, crimes that happen in the modern world today. Okay? So there's all sorts of really, really big fancy names that we use today. Like, for example, clickjacking. Hijacking clicks on the internet so that when you think you're clicking on link X, it really takes you to web page Y. It could be something as traditional or simple as extortion. It could be investment fraud that you might have to analyze. Something like software piracy or copyright piracy, denial of service, auction frauds, all right, email bombs, spam, and hoaxes. You would think that by the year 2015, we wouldn't be pushing out 80% of all email still being, spam-oriented and unauthorized solicitations and things like that. But the fact of the matter is email is still very, very popular of a tool. You have identity theft, which is another multi-billion-dollar industry. You have viruses and worms and Trojans, a little bit more traditional computer security oriented. You have malware or malicious software, and you're seeing these become ever so important, especially if you just look at the news. I'm not going to mention any names here, but if you just look at the news and recent events and see that malicious software has been used to basically data mine credit card systems, and some of the largest companies that you would think would have their act together are actually having to go through the incident handling process and really just cover themselves dramatically, because even the best of us are still vulnerable. Cyber stalking or cyberbullying, right? Financial fraud, child pornography, embezzlement, and countless more examples of new terms and names like phishing, which is really just throwing the net out there and seeing what you get, or farming, which is once you throw that phishing net out there, somebody's got to collect that information, or whaling, going after like the CEO or a big person of a company, or spear phishing, very, very targeted phishing attacks. All right, so there's no shortage of types of crimes that we have to investigate these days, ultimately to insert any of the specifics here into a generic process, a life cycle of sorts, and ultimately identify the evidence, preserve it, extract it, analyze it, document it, and present